Hello, folks. We're back again talking to you about The Great Gatsby in our distance learning program here. We're talking about Chapter 7 today, where one of the climaxes takes place. And we know it's probably going to be, there's probably going to be a climax because it is hot. All of the characters are talking about how hot it is. Is it hot enough for you? You can probably count how many times they say the word hot in the chapter. But it also indicates to us that things are going to heat up in the action, that the characters and the relationships are going to heat up, and there's going to be probably some anger, as we know. And so we're going to look into now Chapter 7. We begin Chapter 7 at the Buchanan Mansion. Now, we were there back in Chapter 1, only this time the Buchanan Mansion activities involve Gatsby. We look at what Nick notices. Nick is our guide, if you remember, through the novel, the Pathfinder, that we follow along, and it's through his eyes that we really see everything that is happening. One of the first things Nick notices is the parallel we see between what happened in Chapter 1 and what's happening now at the Buchanan Mansion. Nick realizes that Jordan and Daisy are still on the couch. Tom is still on the phone. It's almost like nothing's changed. And for us, that's in many respects an indication that the lives of these people are pretty shallow and repetitive. What is a little different on page 120, 121 of the novel, or excuse me, 122. This is now a good time to recommend that you pick up your novel and follow along with us. This is in the hardcover book. Nick notices that Daisy and Jordan lay upon an enormous couch like silver idols, weighing down their own white dresses against the singing breeze of the fans. It's a little different, slightly different. For instance, at the beginning in Chapter 1, Nick was noticing that the breeze was coming in through the windows. It was a natural breeze. Now it's a singing breeze of the fans. Jordan and Daisy in Chapter 1 were kind of floating down, and Nick notices here that they are weighed down. They still are wearing white dresses, however, and he even refers to them as silver idols, silver meaning wealth, and idols, things that you worship. Tom is also on the phone, like he was in Chapter 1, with supposedly his mistress, only this time Daisy doesn't really mind so much because she knows that Gatsby is coming over for lunch. But we see this shallow, repetitive lifestyle. In Chapter 1, Daisy makes a comment about pretty soon it's going to be the longest day of the year. And in this chapter, she says, well, what do we do with ourselves for the next 30 years? And, you think maybe life, being a billionaire with all this time on your hands and all this money would make your life interesting, that you do something. And these people are doing nothing with their lives. They don't even know what to do, it says, for the next 30 years. Gatsby also, we'd like you to recognize, is standing on a crimson carpet, and that could be a little bit of foreshadowing down the way. Jordan notices some behavior on Daisy's behalf. Chapter 1, Jordan was fascinated by this affair that Tom was having and the phone calls that were going on. But now it almost seems like Jordan's getting a little tired of it, especially since it involves Daisy. At one point, Daisy tells Gatsby that she loves him when Tom is out of the room, and Jordan responds to that by indicating that it is low and vulgar. She says, "What a low, vulgar girl! That behavior is kind of unbecoming her." We also see in this chapter Gatsby's reaction to Daisy's daughter. If you recall, in Chapter 6, Gatsby said to Nick, "You can repeat the past." Nick says, "You can't repeat the past." And Gatsby says, "Can't repeat the past." Well, of course you can. And one of the things that kind of gets in the way of Gatsby being able to repeat his past with Daisy is the fact that there is a physical obstacle, and that physical obstacle is Daisy's daughter. And she sort of represents what's getting in the way, in the fact that this is a physical representation of Tom and Daisy's marriage. And you can't really take back a child. A child is there. What also occurs in this chapter, or in this section of the novel, is that Daisy and Gatsby seem to have a moment. Unfortunately, the moment that they have, when it says their eyes met and they stared together at each other alone in space, they do that in front of Daisy's husband. And it doesn't go well. In fact, Daisy looks at him across the table in this beautifully romantic scene, and she says, "You always look so cool," right after she finished complaining about how hot it was. And that statement, Nick realizes, is that on page 125, he says, their eyes met, as it says here. And then, with an effort, she glanced down at the table. She had told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw. So she didn't really say, "I love you." She said, "You always look so cool." But that was her body language, that was the tone of her voice, and Tom kind of finally caught on at this point. If he didn't catch on already at the party, now he has this awakening, and Nick notices he was astounded. His mouth opened a little, and he looked at Gatsby, then back at Daisy, as if he had just recognized her as he knew a long time ago. And that, in many respects, refers to the look on Daisy's face. She has that look of love and admiration that she's directing towards Gatsby now, whereas probably in the past, Tom would have realized she was making those looks at him. So he notices that Daisy has feelings for this man, and now what is he going to do about it? And Nick notices he got up, his eyes. There's eyes still flashing between Gatsby and his wife. No one moved. So, wow, major awkward situation. And then just at that moment, they decide, or Tom decides, that they are indeed going to go to town, even though he really doesn't want to. Things are heating up. Maybe this will kind of cool things down a little bit. So they all go outside and they get ready to go to town. Now, at this point, not only was Jordan getting a little bit annoyed at this whole obvious situation that's going on and the fact that they're kind of having to witness this, but even Nick gets in on it. And he tells Gatsby that Daisy has an indiscreet voice on page 127. He's almost like saying, "Come on, guy, cool it. You are with her husband. You could maybe not be so obvious." And Gatsby responds in a very interesting way. Rather than saying, "Oh, I love her voice," or "Oh, no, she's not," or defending her, he says something really odd. He says, "Her voice is full of money." And that just seems very, very strange, because she's supposed to be this woman that he idolizes and that he's romantically in love with, and he notices something very objective about her. He notices that her voice is full of money, and it is at that moment that Nick gets sort of a glimpse as to really what Gatsby's after. He says on page 127, "High in a white palace, the king's daughter, the golden girl." And Nick realizes Daisy is Gatsby's golden girl. She represents everything that he's striving for in life. Maybe she is not as important as what she stands for, perhaps. And Nick is realizing that at this moment. Well, because Tom has just found out, or just really kind of it's dawned on him that there's somebody sort of taking his possession, which he considers to be Daisy, he decides he's going to take Gatsby's possession. So he doesn't ask, but he says, "Just Gatsby, let me drive," or he just says, "Let me drive your car." And so he decides arbitrarily, well, if you're possessing my wife at this point, I'm going to take possession of your car. And so when he does that, of course, Daisy says, "Well, I'm going to go with Gatsby." So she hops into Tom's car with Gatsby, and that leaves Tom, Nick, and Jordan to all fit into Gatsby's car. A little bit awkward, but it's important for us to know where the cars, who's in what car on the way to town. So we pay attention to that. We also, not only has Tom made now this recognition that his wife might be cheating on him with Gatsby, but he also announces to Nick and Jordan that he's been looking into Gatsby, that he has found out that he's maybe involved in some shady activities. These drug stores that he has maybe are just a front to transport alcohol, which we call bootlegging. And so he's really basically indicating to Nick and Jordan, the jig is up. I know what this guy's up to, and now he's after my wife. This is not going to end well. Well, they drive into the Valley of Ashes because they have to get some gas. And we find here that TJ Eichelberg's eyes are watching. And in fact, On page 129, Nick notices, then as Dr. T.J. Eckelberg's faded eyes came into sight down the road, I remembered Gatsby's caution about gasoline. So they need some gas and they stop at Wilson's. And at this point in time, we have some changes in Myrtle and Wilson's relationship as well. Myrtle's at the window looking down at what's going on, and Wilson has, it says here on page 130, has discovered that Myrtle had some sort of life apart from him in another world, and the shock had made him physically ill. And indeed, Wilson is ill. He's standing at the pumps. He's not feeling well. He tells Tom that he's found out something about his wife, and he's going to move. And at that moment, Tom and Wilson are standing face to face. Both of these men have found out that their wives are cheating on them. Ironically, Wilson's looking into the eyes of the man that his wife is cheating on him with. And Tom has bigger problems to worry about. He's thinking, wow, I'm going to lose my wife. Oh, and I might even lose my mistress. This is not a good day for me, Tom thinks. And we also realize it's not quite a good day for Myrtle as well, as she's looking down and she sees something that she is a little bit terrified of. And in fact, on page 131, it says, her expression was curiously familiar. Myrtle Wilson's face, it seemed purposeless and inexplicable until I realized that her eyes, wide with jealous terror, were fixed not on Tom, but on Jordan, whom she took to be his wife. This is a recognition scene for Myrtle. She does not know what Daisy looks like, but she thinks that Tom is with Daisy right now and is mistaking her for Jordan Baker. And why is she up in that window? Wilson's controlling her in his meek way. He's kept her up there until he can find a way to leave. So Tom and Wilson's relation, or Wilson and Myrtle's relationship, is falling apart here at the same time, only to add to that stress and that terror, as the words say in the novel. Myrtle's realizing that Tom is out with his wife, and that's not going to end well for her, as we know, moving on after the hotel room. But let's get to the hotel room. We like to call it the Heartbreak hotel room because there's a lot of heartbreak that goes on there, but not the entire hotel is full of heartbreak. As we know, in the down below, they hear a wedding going on, which is quite ironic, of course, and interesting to juxtapose this kind of crumbling marriage with the beginning of a marriage at the same hotel. The environment is very, very hot. Daisy even says we'd better telephone for an axe to open up the doors or open up the walls, because just opening the windows isn't enough. It is so hot right now. Something has to give. That's what the environment is in this section. And at that very point, when it gets really hot, Tom makes this explosive statement. He says to Gatsby, what kind of a row are you trying to cause in my house anyhow? And he just lays it right out there. And the elephant that is in the room is now visible basically to everybody. And he confronts Gatsby on a number of things, including his lies. And Gatsby comes back with a little bit of truth. He says, well, no, I really didn't go to Oxford. I didn't graduate from Oxford, but I did go there when after the war we were given an opportunity. And Nick, at this point, who knows Gatsby's been lying, who knows Gatsby's untruthful, is a little bit happy with him. He basically says, I kind of wanted to pat him on the back, because it was one of the first times that he said something honest, that I was, he said, I had one of those renewals of complete faith in him that I'd experienced before. On page 136, he says that. So Gatsby sort of figures, all right, I might as well come clean with all of this, as long as I now have the girl. It was okay for him to be deceptive up until the fact, to the point where he got the girl, and now he can kind of, drop his guard a little bit. That's what he thinks anyway. In fact, he drops his guard so much, he says to Tom, your wife never loved you. Which is a very bold statement. And it takes a lot of courage to say that, especially since he's making that statement without actually conferring with Daisy. I mean, how does he know? And in fact, he finds out very quickly, because Daisy has a breakdown here. Daisy is probably was playing with fire with bringing Gatsby over to her home for her luncheon. And now she's realizing, oh, maybe I didn't want so much fire. And she says to Gatsby, you want too much, because she's not really, on the bottom of page 139, she's not really happy. that Gatsby has brought this out into the open. She just thought she would have a little bit of fun and fill that boredom that she talked about earlier. What are we going to do for the next 30 years? Maybe she didn't want this much excitement. And she tells Gatsby, I love you, but I love Tom too, and I love you. And Gatsby says, you loved me too. And then at that moment, Tom realizes that Gatsby's lost the fight here, because Daisy's not able to give him what he wants. She's not able to say, I never loved Tom, I only loved you, and now I want to go back in time. As soon as he realizes that, as soon as Gatsby realizes, what? You loved me too, Tom takes that moment to throw in the next bit of information about Gatsby. I mean, if you didn't really love him as much as he thinks you did, now I'm going to tell you something very, very unseemly about him. He is a bootlegger, which of course is not a very classy way to earn your money, and certainly not anything that Daisy could buy into. She wants the money. She is the golden girl, but she's the king's daughter. She can't slum it with a criminal, and that's what Tom brings out to the scene. He just says, "Hey, this guy's a lowlife. He might have a lot of money, but he didn't come by it honestly." And at that very moment, as it says here, some things never change. Jordan also gets that impression that this is very classless. This is very base and low. And Nick recognizes it again. If you recall, again, in chapter 1, Jordan, he says here on page 141, had begun to balance an invisible but absorbing object on the tip of her chin. And we talked in chapter 1 about her sort of being arrogant when she tips her chin forward and puts her nose in the air. And she's doing it again. She's like, okay, I'm done with this very uncomfortable scene. And at that moment, Gatsby's heart kind of breaks, but he doesn't really get it because he's too focused on that dream, and he almost really can't let that dream go. So he starts to sort of attempt to get Daisy back. And on the top of page 142, it says, he looked, and this is said with all contempt for the babbled slander of his garden, as if he had killed a man, because he couldn't really believe that this was all falling apart after so many years of working for it. It says it passed, and he began to talk excitedly to Daisy, denying everything, defending his name against accusations that had not been made. So he's trying to pull her back. However, it's too late. Because on page 142, Nick notices that with every word, that means every word Gatsby's throwing at her to try to get her back, she was drawing further and further into herself. And when we see that scene in the movie, if you watch that scene in the movie, the actress does an amazing job of showing that Daisy's just pulling back and pulling back, just like Jordan did. And Nick notices here then with Gatsby, with his behavior, that only, look at the words here, only the dead dream fought on as the afternoon slipped away, trying to touch what was no longer tangible. And that reminds us of when Gatsby's reaching towards that green light at the end of Daisy's dock, and he's trembling and he can't quite reach it. He's struggling to reach something he can't obtain, and now here he is. He really can't obtain it, unhappily, undespairingly, toward that lost voice. And but what you need to pay attention to is the fact that the dead dream, which the dream is dead, fought on. He, for some reason, that dream has really become taken on a life of its own, and he cannot give it up. However, Tom realizes it's done. In fact, he's so arrogant and so sure that Daisy and Gatsby's little flirtation, or as he says, he realizes is his presumptuous little flirtation is over, that he tells Gatsby, take her home. You're no threat to me anymore. Not only was Jordan pulling back, we see poor Nick, and we know how incredibly awkward all of this has been for him all along. He recognizes something quite interesting, and it sort of seems random when he says it. He says, today's my birthday. I'm 30 years old. And when you look at the fact that Nick in chapter 1 talks about coming out to the East with bright ideas and hopes and dreams, and he's going to really plan great things in his life, it almost seems like he's given up and he says, wow, time's marching on. I'm 30 and this was not the experience that I thought it was going to be. Maybe my dreams aren't going to go the way that I thought they were as well. And so it's kind of a downer moment for everyone when everything sort of falls apart. But things have not reached their climax yet, even though this seems a little climactic. So, as we said, at this point, Tom makes another decision. He says, Gatsby, you can take your own car this time. You take your own car into town. I no longer want anything to do with you. And he's putting his possession, Daisy, into his possession, his car, which is quite interesting. So Daisy and Gatsby drive off in Gatsby's car. Excuse me. Misspoke there. Daisy, he's putting his possession, Daisy, into Gatsby's car, but he knows that they're no threat, that Gatsby's no threat anymore. So that's just how sure he is of himself. And they take off and they go towards the house, the Buchanan mansion. And now Tom has regained his possession, his car, and he is driving Nick and Jordan and himself on the way to home. And what's interesting in the little bit of foreshadowing that we get here, he says, Nick recognizes on page 143, so we drove on toward death, which is very, very telling. It's a surprising word when he says we drove on towards death through the cooling twilight. And so notice how things are no longer getting hot. They're now cool. It's twilight. It's towards the end of the day. Things are winding down. But for some reason, Nick uses the word death. And we know why, because of what happens next. The car that Daisy and Gatsby are driving in doesn't stop. And Nick calls it the death car. And one of the characters in the witnesses of the death also call it that. It doesn't stop. And it doesn't stop after it hits Myrtle, and there's a hit and run. And when Nick and Tom and Jordan come upon the hullabaloo that's going on at Wilson's garage, they think, oh, wow, this is great for business. And they pull in and they realize this is not so great because Myrtle's dead, and Tom has to kind of suck it up and not show his emotions that he has towards Myrtle because he's in front of her grieving husband. So this is the climax of the novel when and it's really kind of occurs off the scenes. They don't even really describe the actual death in the novel, or in the movie they'll show you that, but the novel, the climax is sort of behind the scenes. Myrtle has been struck by the car that Gatsby and Daisy were in, and that's a pretty big deal. And it really kind of indicates the turn in the novel. The fun is now over. Someone has died. It's all fun and games until someone's hit by a car and killed. And so that's kind of what happens. And Nick at this point has had it. He has had his fill of all these people. He's done with them. He says on page 150, I had enough of all of them. And it echoes back to the beginning of chapter 1 where he says, by the fall, I'd had enough and I needed to come back. I didn't want any more glimpses into the secret lives of men or whatever. And he's done. And he says this, he makes this particular statement after Jordan invites him in. Now, they've just witnessed a hit and run. They've just witnessed a bloody body. And Jordan says, hey, you want to come in and eat? And Nick is disgusted. And it says he's sick. And when he says he's sick, that kind of is an indication that we need to be sick. We need to be sick of this whole situation with him. Gatsby then he sees lurking in the bushes, which is kind of odd. And he says, what are you even doing? And he's angry. He's angry because he thinks Gatsby has committed a hit and run. And Gatsby very nonchalantly says, well, I'm just standing here, old sport. Did you see any trouble on the road? And Nick is just incensed at this point because Gatsby's saying, oh, I really feel bad for Daisy. It was quite a shock for her. And Nick's like, what do you mean it was a shock? That woman's dead. And we realize now that the person who was driving the car was not Gatsby. It was Daisy. Now, oddly, he was allowing Daisy to drive because she was feeling shaken up, and he thought that it would calm her nerves, which is a very odd statement to make. We know better. The early days of driving, I guess that's what they thought. But if somebody's physically upset, we don't say, "Here, get behind the wheel." But that's what he did, and so we find out that the accident was indeed an accident. It was not on purpose. Myrtle had run out into the road, and of course, we know that that yellow car that she saw going into town contained Tom. So she figured, here's this yellow car again. It must have Tom in it. She was able to break free, run out, and try to get that car to stop, and it didn't happen. It says, well, I tried to swing the wheel. Gatsby was trying to help Daisy here, but it didn't happen. So, again, he's only concerned about Daisy's reaction. So he asks Nick to go check on him. Nick does go check on him. He goes and finds out that Daisy and Tom are having a moment of natural intimacy. Interesting that the word used here is natural, because they are the married couple. They've been together longer than Daisy and Gatsby ever were. They've got a relationship and experiences, as Tom explained, that supersede anything that Gatsby and Daisy might have experienced. And it says here that, Gatsby noticed that the only thing that mattered was Daisy's happiness, and that seems to be what's happening in that window as Nick looks in on the fact that Tom and Daisy are having a natural intimacy moment. She looked up at him and nodded in agreement. They were conspiring together. Now, I don't want you to be confused here. It's not really very probable that Daisy knew who that woman was. She'd never met Jordan. She'd never met Myrtle, and Daisy had never met Myrtle, and Myrtle had never met Daisy. So neither one of them knew who the other one was. And so it was clearly just an accident, a hit and run, and it was tragic because a woman died in the process. So the conspiring together probably had more to do with what happened in that hotel room and how they were going to kind of get their lives back on track. Gatsby doesn't know this, though. And so he tells Nick he's going to just stay there and watch and make sure that Tom doesn't create any trouble for Daisy. Of course, we know that's not what's going to happen. And Nick knows too, because the very last lines of Chapter 7 are, he left him there watching over nothing. And the key word there is nothing. Nothing to see. Gatsby had no reason to stay. The presumptuous little flirtation is over, as Tom says. And that's how we go into Chapter 8. Now, if you recall, I said there was a climax that was going to be coming after this chapter. So the action is still definitely to come. So keep reading, folks, and thanks for listening.